The fertilizer invoice sat on the kitchen table. March 1984. Anhydrous ammonia had gone to $245 per ton. Urea was $168. Phosphate was climbing. The numbers didn't look like farming anymore. They looked like betting. Tom Warren spread his field maps across the table. 480 acres of corn ground. Standard application rates meant $42 per acre in nitrogen alone. Add phosphorus and potassium. Call it $65 per acre total, times 480 acres. $31,200 in fertilizer before seed touched dirt. He had $8,400 in the bank. The rest would have to be borrowed. The phone rang all week. Other farmers were already at the bank. The Hendersons secured a $40,000 operating loan at 5% interest. The Mitchells borrowed $55,000 at 14%. Everyone was doing it. Input costs were up, but so was the plan. Apply heavy, push yield, sell into what everyone hoped would be a recovered market. The agricultural extension agent said the same thing at every meeting. Modern corn hybrids need nitrogen. You can't grow 150 bushel corn on hope. The science is clear. Under-fertilize and you're leaving money in the field. Warren didn't argue with the science. The math was the problem. He pulled out last year's settlement sheets. Corn had averaged $3, 18 per bushel at harvest. December futures were sitting at $3.45. If prices held and yield came in at 145 bushels per acre, gross income would be $500 per acre. Subtract $65 for fertilizer, $48 for seed, $32 for chemicals, $28 for fuel, $15 for drying, $22 for hired labor. Operating costs alone pushed $210 per acre before fixed costs, before loan interest, before anything broke. The margin was thin. Borrowing made it thinner. Warren's neighbor stopped by Thursday afternoon, saw the fertilizer invoice still sitting there. You waiting on something? Just running numbers. We borrowed Tuesday. Bank's got a short-term note at 5%. Pay it back at harvest. Everyone's doing it. Interest costs are just part of the deal now. Warren nodded. What if corn drops? Drops to what? $3. They are zeros. Silence. Then, it won't drop that far. Market stabilizing. But if it does, we're all in trouble. But if you don't fertilize and everyone else does, you'll have 90 bushel corn next to their 150 bushel corn. You'll lose either way. Warren didn't have a good answer for that. The logic was tight. Borrowing felt risky. Not borrowing felt riskier. Friday morning, he walked out to the machine shed. The old John Deere field cultivator sat against the back wall. 4-row unit, spring-loaded shanks, sweep blades for cutting weeds below the surface. His father had bought it in 1967. Warren had used it heavy until 1979, then switched to chemical weed control. Faster, simpler, more acres per day. But chemicals cost money. The cultivator just cost time. He pulled the tarp off, checked the shanks. Surface rust, but the metal was solid. The springs still had tension. The toolbar was straight. It would work. Monday, Warren went to the co-op. Didn't buy fertilizer. Bought cultivator sweeps instead. $340 for a full set. The co-op manager watched him load them. You're not fertilizing? Not this year. That's a mistake. Yield's going to suffer. Probably. You'll be 40, 50 bushels behind everyone else. Probably. So, why do it? Because I can't afford to borrow $25,000 and hope corn prices hold. The manager didn't argue, just shook his head. Warren drove home with the cultivator sweeps. That was the decision. Lower cost structure, lower yield, lower risk. They borrowed. He waited. April came cold. Planting was late across the whole region. Warren went into the fields anyway. No fertilizer to apply, no pre-plant chemicals to spray, just the cultivator. He made the first pass shallow, 3 inches deep. Cut the winter weeds, incorporated the surface residue. The soil turned dark and loose. 2 weeks later, he cultivated again. different angle, cross pattern. Got the weeds that had germinated after the first pass. The field looked clean, but it had taken 14 hours to cover what chemicals would have handled in 3. The neighbors noticed, saw him running the cultivator while they were spreading fertilizer. Henderson stopped at the fence line. "You're not using nitrogen?" "Not this year." "You know what that'll do to your yield?" "Yeah." "You're going to lose money." "Maybe." "No maybe about it. Corn needs nitrogen. Everyone knows that." Warren shut off the tractor, looked at Henderson. "What if corn goes to 2 hours or 80? Won't happen. But if it does, then we're all in trouble. But at least we tried to farm right." Warren started the tractor again. Didn't say what he was thinking, that trying and borrowing weren't the same thing. Planting started May 3rd. Warren put seed in the ground at standard population, 28,000 seeds per acre, no starter fertilizer, no in-furrow insecticide, just seed and soil. His fields looked the same as everyone else's, for now. By mid-May, the differences started showing. The fertilized fields were darker green, the corn was taller, Warren's fields looked paler. The plants were growing but slower. Growth stage V4 came a week behind the neighboring fields. At the diner, people talked. Warren's corn looks thin. Didn't fertilize. Why not? Trying to save money. That's not saving, that's losing. Warren ate his breakfast, didn't join the conversation. The cultivator kept moving. He made a third pass at V3 growth stage, came within 4 inches of the row, got the weeds before they established. The corn looked clean, but it looked small. June brought heat. The fertilized fields exploded, deep green, tall stalks, V8, V10, V12, fast growth, high potential. Warren's fields were 2 stages behind, V8 when the others were V10. Lighter color, slower canopy development. Everyone could see it from the road. The bank officer drove out one afternoon, saw the fields, saw the color difference, stopped at the shop where Warren was greasing the cultivator. "Your corn doesn't look good." "I know." "You have crop insurance? Standard coverage?" "Might want to check your policy. This looks like it could be a partial loss claim." Warren set down the grease gun. "It's not a loss. It's just less. Less is still a loss when you're trying to make payments. Not making payments this year. Fields paid for. Machinery's paid for. I don't owe operating money." The banker absorbed that. Didn't quite know how to respond. Most people owe something. That's what makes this work. People borrow against yield, invest in inputs, harvest big, pay back the loan, unless yield doesn't come, or prices drop, or both. The banker got back in his truck. Warren went back to greasing. July was critical. Pollination, ear development, maximum nutrient demand. The fertilized fields were at R1 stage, silking, heavy canopy. Deep root systems pulling nitrogen from 200 units per acre. Warren's fields hit R1 a week late. Thinner canopy, smaller ear potential. The corn was pulling from soil reserves and whatever organic matter had mineralized. It wasn't much. Henderson walked Warren's field one evening, stood between the rows. "Your ears are small." "I know." "You're gonna get maybe 100 bushels, maybe. Could have been 150 with proper fertility." "Probably." Henderson shook his head. "I don't understand this. You're a good farmer. You know what corn needs. Why handicap yourself?" Warren bent down, pulled a soil sample with his pocket knife. The dirt was dark. Organic matter was decent. Not rich, but decent. "Because I ran the numbers. If I fertilize, I borrow $30,000. At 5%, that's $4,000 in interest for 7 months. If corn comes in at 150 bushels and sells for $3, 20, I gross $480 per acre. Subtract $210 in operating costs, I net $207. That's $129,600 total. Minus the loan and interest, I clear $95,600. Henderson listened. Warren kept going. "Without fertilizer, I'll get 100 bushels. maybe 105. At $3.20, that's $336 gross per acre. Operating costs dropped to $145 per acre. I net $191 per acre. That's $91,600 total. $4,000 less than the fertilizer scenario. So you lose money? Not necessarily. What if corn goes to $2? 90? Then the fertilized scenario nets $435 gross, minus $210 costs, equals $225 per acre. That's $108,000. Minus $34,000 in loans and interest, I clear $74,000. The low input scenario at $290 gives me $290 gross, minus $145 costs, equals $145 per acre. That's $69,600 total. Henderson stared. Those numbers were close, too close. And if corn drops to $2, 60? Warren asked. Henderson didn't want to do that math. At $2, 60, the fertilized scenario goes negative on operating margin. You'd gross $390 per acre, subtract $210, net $180. That's $86,400, minus $34,000 loan. You'd clear $52,400. I'd still gross $260, net $115 per acre, and keep $55,200. No debt. Yield means nothing if the bank owns the margin. Henderson walked back to his truck. He'd borrowed $40,000. Interest was adding up. Corn futures have been dropping slowly since May. Nothing dramatic. Just steady erosion. Down to $3. 28s. Then 3. 15. The commercials were getting nervous. August brought the reality. Corn harvest projections came in heavy. National yield estimates climbed. Carryover stocks were building. Export demand was soft. Prices started sliding harder. $3.05 per bushel. Then $2.92, then $2.78. The phone calls started. Farmers talking to their bankers, renegotiating terms, asking for extensions. The operating loans that had seemed reasonable in March were looking dangerous in August. Henderson's fertilized corn came in at 148 bushels per acre. Strong yield. He'd done everything right agronomically, but at $2.78 per acre, gross income was $411 per acre. Operating costs of $210 per acre left him $201 per acre net. Times 520 acres, that was $104,520. His loan was $40,000 plus $5,400 in interest. After paying the bank, he cleared $5,920. Before land payments, before equipment costs, before family living expenses. He'd grown excellent corn and barely covered his cash costs. The Mitchells did worse. They'd borrowed $55,000. Heavy fertilizer program came in at 152 bushels per acre, but they had 380 acres. At $2.78 per bushel, they grossed $422 per acre. Operating costs were $218 per acre. Net was 204s times 380 acres, $77,520. After loan and interest, they cleared $16,720. They'd farmed 380 acres, put in 6 months of labor, and made less than $20,000. Warren's corn came in at 102 bushels per acre. Lighter yield, smaller ears. But at $2.78, he grossed $283 per acre. Operating costs of $145 left him $138 per acre net. Times 480 acres, $66,240. No loan, no interest. That was his profit. He'd made more per acre than Henderson and avoided the debt that was breaking the Mitchells. At the co-op, the conversations changed. You hear about Mitchell? He's trying to refinance. Henderson's cutting back next year. Warren's the only guy who's not sweating. The manager, who'd questioned the no-fertilizer plan, didn't say much now. Just check the numbers. Warren's fertilizer bill for the year was $0. His chemical costs were $15 per acre instead of $32. His fuel costs were higher from the extra cultivator passes, but still less than the money he'd saved on inputs. The cultivator sweeps cost $340. They'd paid for themselves 10 times over. September brought the calls. Warren's phone rang twice a week. Farmers wanting to talk, wanting to understand how he'd made it work. Did you know prices would drop? No. So why didn't you fertilize? Because I couldn't afford to be wrong. That was the difference. The other farmers had borrowed on the assumption that yield would overcome price risk. Warren had eliminated the assumption by cutting the cost structure. Borrowing buys speed. It also buys risk. October was sorting time. Some farmers were talking about getting out. The debt load was too heavy. The margins were too thin. Equipment payments were stacking up behind operating loans. The banks were getting careful about extending credit. Warren was planning next year. Same approach. Cultivator instead of chemicals where possible. Minimal fertilizer, lower cost base, lower yield potential but lower exposure. Henderson stopped by one evening, sat on the tailgate, watched the sun set over the harvested fields. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he said. "What's the problem?" "Money. I'm making payments, but I'm not getting ahead. Every year I borrow more just to plant the crop. This year taught me I can't count on prices. So what do I do?" Warren didn't have easy answers. "You cut costs. Where?" "Everywhere you can. Fertilizer, chemicals, equipment, labor. Everything that requires borrowing." Henderson shook his head. "But then yield drops. So does risk." Henderson sat quiet for a while. Then he asked the question he'd been avoiding. "Can you teach me how to run a cultivator?" Warren nodded. "Yeah, I can do that." Winter came hard. The 1984 harvest was over. Corn prices settled around $2.65 per bushel. Soybeans were worse. The farm economy was stressed. Banks were tightening. Some operations were folding. Warren ran his numbers. Profit for the year, 66 sacks and 240. Not a record, not spectacular, but solid. More importantly, his balance sheet was clean. No operating debt, no deferred payments, no desperate refinancing. He pulled the cultivator into the shop, changed the sweeps, greased the bearings, adjusted the shanks. The machine was simple. Spring steel and toolbar. No computers, no hydraulics, just mechanical leverage moving through dirt. It would work next year the same way it had worked this year. Slow, deliberate, functional. The phone rang in January. "Henderson, I talked to the bank. They'll refinance my operating loan if I cut input costs by 30%. That means less fertilizer. I need to make that cultivator work. When can you show me how to set it up?" February was cold, but Warren and Henderson spent 3 days in the shop. Set shank spacing, adjusted depth, talked about timing, when to cultivate, how many passes, what to watch for. Henderson took notes. "This is going to be slower than chemicals." "Yeah, but it costs $300 in sweeps instead of $15,000 in fertilizer and spray. That's the trade-off. Less yield, less risk." Henderson nodded. "I'm not sure I have a choice anymore." By March 1985, 6 farmers in the area were pulling cultivators out of storage, equipment that hadn't run in 5 years. The dealers noticed. Cultivator sweep sales were up, fertilizer sales were down. The shift was quiet but real. The market does not reward courage, it punishes exposure. Warren didn't talk about being right. He'd made a decision based on his numbers and his risk tolerance. It had worked, but it could have gone differently. If corn had held at $340, the farmers who'd borrowed and fertilized heavy would have made more money. The math would have justified their approach. But corn hadn't held. And the difference between $3.40 and $2.65 was the difference between profit and survival. April 1985. Warren made his first cultivator pass, 3 inches deep, turned the winter weeds under. The field looked clean and dark. Not as dark as it would have looked with 200 units of nitrogen, but clean. Henderson was running his cultivator 2 fields over, learning the rhythm. The pace was slower than he liked, but the cost was manageable. Behind them, the bank officer drove past, saw both farmers running mechanical cultivation, saw the fertilizer dealer's truck sitting idle at the co-op. The whole pattern was shifting. He understood what was happening. When margins get thin, survival depends on expenses, not revenue. The farmers who could cut costs were the farmers who would make it. The ones locked into high-input systems were vulnerable. Warren cultivated through May, made 3 passes before planting, planted into clean ground, no fertilizer, minimal chemicals. His cost per acre was projected at $142. If corn came in at 100 bushels and $2.80 per bushel, he'd net $138 per acre. If it came in at 105 bushels and $3.00, he'd net $173 per acre. Neither scenario was spectacular. Both were survivable. That was the point. Not maximum yield, not aggressive expansion, just consistent operation within a cost structure that didn't require perfect prices. The cultivator kept moving. The fields stayed clean. The corn grew slower than the fertilized fields, but it grew. By June, Warren's corn was at V6. The heavily fertilized operations were at V8. The difference was visible, but not catastrophic. The bank officer stopped by again. "Your corn still looks thin. Same as last year." "Yeah." "But you're still farming." "Yeah." The officer nodded. "Half the farmers I'm working with are restructuring debt. You're the only one who's not asking for extensions. That's because I'm not borrowing operating money. Not many people farm that way anymore." "I know." The officer got back in his truck, drove past Henderson's field. Henderson's corn looked the same as Warren's. Thin but growing, low input but functional. The bank had refinanced Henderson's debt, but only after he'd committed to cutting costs. The cultivator was part of that commitment. July brought pollination. Warren's corn hit R1 on schedule. Smaller ears than last year's high-input fields, but normal for a low-fertility program. Yield projections were running 98 to 103 bushels per acre. Not great, just adequate. August brought harvest anxiety. Corn prices were bouncing between $2.55 and $2.85. The range wasn't good. Farmers needed $3 to make standard input programs work. Anything below that was stress. Warren watched the markets, but didn't panic. At $2.70 per acre, his break-even was secure. At $2.55, he'd still net $113 per acre. Low, but positive. He could farm another year. September came with harvest. Warren's yield was 101 bushels per acre. Corn prices settled at $2.68. He grossed $270 per acre. Operating costs of $142 left him $128 per acre, times 480 acres, $61,440. Not a record year, not a disaster, just another year of farming within his means. Henderson came in at 104 bushels per acre. His cost structure was still higher than Warren's, but down from 1984. He cleared $47,000 after loan payments. Tight, but he'd survived. The Mitchells sold out. They couldn't make the debt work. Too many years of borrowing against yield. Too many seasons of hoping prices would recover. The bank took the equipment. The land went to auction. October was quiet. Warren serviced the cultivator, changed sweeps, greased the toolbar. The machine had run 180 hours during the season, covered the same ground 3 times that chemicals would have covered once. But the cost was $340 in sweeps and $280 in extra fuel instead of $15,000 in fertilizer and chemicals. The trade-off was clear: time versus money, yield versus solvency. Warren had chosen solvency. The dealer stopped by in November, saw the cultivator. "You're still using this?" "Yeah. Looks like a few other guys are too." "Heard that. You think this is the new normal?" "Don't know. But when margins get thin, people look for ways to cut costs, and mechanical cultivation is the cheapest weed control you can get." The dealer nodded. "Fertilizer sales are down 40% in this county. Chemical sales are down 25%. Cultivator sales are up. The market's telling us something." Warren didn't respond. The market had been telling them something for 2 years. Most people just hadn't wanted to listen. Winter, 1985. Warren sat at the kitchen table, same spot where the fertilizer invoice had sat in March 1984. This time there was no invoice, just a balance sheet. Assets, land, equipment, grain inventory, liabilities, 0, operating debt. equity, stable. He'd farmed 480 acres for 2 years without borrowing operating money. The yields had been lower than his neighbors. The profit had been lower than peak years. But he'd survived when others hadn't. That was worth something, maybe everything. The phone rang. Another farmer asking about the cultivator. Warren talked him through the setup, explained the timing, laid out the cost structure. The conversation took an hour. When he hung up, he looked out the window. The cultivator sat in the shed, 48 years old, simple, mechanical, functional. It didn't promise high yields, it promised low costs. In 1984 and 1985, that difference had decided everything. They borrowed. He waited. The cultivator kept moving. Costs matter. Not every season tests that equation. But when it does, the farmers who understand exposure are the farmers who survive. Warren understood. He'd built his operation around that understanding. Lower yield, lower cost, lower risk. The market had validated the approach, not with spectacular profits, just with survival. And in farming, survival is success when half the county can't say the same. If stories about resilience and managing risk matter to you, subscribe. Because sometimes survival isn't about growing more. It's about owing less.